Okay, so, hmm, chapter 2 The Boy. Okay. Hmm. After Silas slams shut the door, Albie bites the shilling between his front tooth and gums, for no reason except that he has seen his sister do the same. He sucks on it. It tastes sweet. He is pleased. He never expected two bob. But if you ask for two bob and you get a bob, what happens if you ask for a bob? He shrugs, spits it out, and then tucks it into his pocket. He will buy a bowl of boiled pig's ears for his lunch and give his sister the rest. But first, he has another task to complete, and he is already late. There is a second hemp sack next to his dead creature's bag, which contains tiny skirts he sewed through the night. He is careful never to mix the two. Sometimes, as he hands over the bag at the doll shop, he is convinced he has mulled them, and he feels an arrow quiver in his heart. He would not like to see Mrs. Salter's sour face if she opened a bag of maggoty rats. He blows on his little fists to warn them and takes off at a run. The boy zigzags through the streets, rickety legs bowed outwards. He runs west through the muck of Soho. Gaunt horse track his racing limbo with tatty eyes, just as worn-out cats watch a fly. He emerges on to the Regent Street, glances at the shop which sells sets of teeth for 4 guineas, taps his single tooth with his tongue, and then catapults into the path of a horse. It bucks, rears. He leaps back and masters his fear by bellowing at the coachman. Watch it go. And before the man has had a chance to shout back at him or crack him with his whip, Albie has darted across the street and crossed the threshold of Mrs. Salter's doll emporium. Okay. Um, Next chapter. Mrs. Salter's doll emporium. Iris runs her thumbnail down the seams of the miniature skirts, poised to crack the shells of any fleas. She picks at a loose thread, then knots it. Even though it is almost noon, her mistress, Mrs. Salter, is yet to rise for the day. Her twin sister sits behind her, head bowed over her sewing. Flealess, at least. But do take more care with the threads, Iris says to Albie. There's a whole city of seamstresses who would sell their newborns to pinch the warp off you. But, miss, my sister's got influenza and I nursed her through the night. I ain't even been able to go skating for days and it ain't fair either. Poor thing, Iris looks around, but her sister Rose is preoccupied. She lowers her voice. But you must remember you are dealing with a devil, not a woman. In Mrs. Salter, and fairness never has been a concern of hers. Have you ever been her stick out? Have you ever seen her stick out her tongue? Albie shakes his head. It's forked. Albie's smile is so open, so free of artifice that Iris wants to embrace him. His mucky blonde hair, his single fang, his soot-stained face, none of these things are his fault. In another world, he could have been born into their family in Hackney. She tucks the next stack of fabric into his bag, checks again that Rose isn't looking, and then hands him sixpence. She planned to put it towards a new sheet of paper and a paintbrush to buy broth for your sister. Albie stares at the coin hesitant. It isn't a trick, she says. Thank you, miss, he says, his eyes as black as pin tops. He snatches it from her as if afraid she will change her mind and scampers out of the shop, almost barreling into the Italian organ grinder who swats him with his cane. Iris watches him go and allows herself to inhale. He may be a filthy little urchin, but even so, she can never understand why he stinks quite so foully of decay. The slender Regent Street shop is wedged between two rival confectioners. Due to slight fissures in the chimney, Mrs. Salter's doll emporium is perpetually filled with the smells of boiled sugar and burnt caramel. Sometimes Iris dreams of eating bonbons and plum jellies. Perfect little cakes with flared pastry and whipped cream of riding gingerbread elephants down to Buckingham Palace. Other times she dreams that she is drowning in boiling treacle. When the Whittle sisters were first apprenticed to Mrs. Salter, whether she is or ever was married is a mystery to Iris. Iris was mesmerized by the salon. Given her twisted collarbone and Rose's smallpox scars, she expected that they would be shut in the cellar storeroom. Instead, they were directed to a gilded bureau in the middle of the shop floor where interested customers could observe their work. She was handed powdered paints and foxhair brushes for decorating the doll's feet, hands, and faces. Of course, she knew that the days would be long, but she marveled over the ebony dressers which ran the length of the room, their shelves crammed with porcelain dolls. It was warm and light too, candles sizzled in gold brackets, and there was a fire in the corner. But now, as she sits at the desk next to her sister, clasping a china doll and a scuffed brush, she is struggling to stifle a yawn. It is a weight of exhaustion she never could have imagined, a druggery greater than if the shop were a factory. Her hands are red and cracked from the winter cold, but if she greases them with tallow, the paintbrush slips from her grasp and she botches the doll's lips and cheeks. She looks around her at the dressers, which are not ebony but cheap oak painted black, at the gold varnish which peels from the bracket due to. Hmm. looks around her at the dresses which are not ebony but cheap oak painted black, at the gold varnish which peels from the brackets due to the heat of the candle flames. And her least favorite thing of all, the balding patch of carpet where Mrs. Salter places daily, now worn where Mrs. Salter paces daily, now worn thinner than her mistress's hair. The sticky smell of confectionery, the airlessness of the room, and the staring rows of dolls make it seem more like a crypt than a shop. There are times when Iris struggles to catch her breath. Dead, Iris whispers to her twin sister, nudging a daguerreotype towards her. It is a small sepia image of a little girl, her hands folded as neatly as doves in her lap. Iris glances up when Mrs. Salter enters the shop and sits by the door, the spine of her Bible crackling as she opens it. Rose tries to silence her with a look. It is one of Iris's few enjoyments, even if it does make her feel guilty, assessing whether the children in the daguerreotypes are dead for a reason she can't explain. She likes to know whether she is making a mourning doll to be placed on the grave of a deceased infant, or if she is painting a plaything for a bouncing living child. Mrs. Salter derives the bulk of her income from this custom doll service. It is winter now, and the cold and its sickness doubles her workload, often tipping their working hours from 12 to 20. It is understandable, Mrs. Salter will say in her customer voice, and indeed natural that you would want to commemorate a dear past spirit. After all, as it is in Corinthians, we are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. Their soul is gone, and this doll is a symbol of the earthly vessel they left behind. Deducing whether the children in the images are dead can be a subtle operation. But Iris has learned the cues. Sometimes it is easy. The child appears to be sleeping surrounded by flowers. There might be a clear prop behind the infant, even a person holding them who is hidden to look like upholstery, or if there are other people in the daguerreotype, the exposure will blur all but one child who is picked out in perfect unmoving clarity. Alive, Iris decides her eyes are blurred. Silence. I will not tolerate chatter. Mrs. Saltry barks with the sudden flare of a lit match. Iris dips her head, then mixes a slightly deeper pink for the shadow between the doll's lips. She does not look up, dreads inviting one of Mrs. Salter's pinches, which are delivered to the soft insides of her elbow. The girls sit side by side for the day, barely speaking, barely moving, pausing only for a meal of beef drippings and bread. Iris paints the porcelain faces, threads the hair through the holes in the scalp, sometimes curls it with irons heated in the coal if the child has ringlets. Meanwhile, Rose's needle rises and falls like a violinist. Her job is to add the finer, more skilled detail to the rough skirts and bodices which the slop sewers make through the night. Seat pearls, ruched sleeves, passementery trimmings, tiny velvet buttons as small as mouse noses. Even though they are identical, the twins could not be less alike. As young girls, Rose was always singled out as the real beauty of the two, their parents' favorite, and she clutched this understanding like a treasure. Iris's wrapped collarbone, a birth defect which causes her left shoulder to hunch forward, invited a protective kindness from her sister, which only occasionally irritated Iris. I am not an invalid, you know, She would snap as Rose insisted on carrying any parcels, striding ahead as if expecting Iris to fall in line behind her. They squabbled too, arguing over the largest roast potato at dinner, who over who could skip the longest, ride the neatest. They could deal blows of quick cruelty because they knew that with each fight a there would be a reconciliation. Limbs overlapping as they sat by the fire, dreaming up details of their imaginary shop flora, its shelves brimming with flowered trinkets, wall brackets stuffed with irises and roses. But when the sisters turned 16, Rose contracted smallpox, which nearly killed her. She said she wished it had when she saw the thick rash of boils covering her face and body and cloudy roll of her blinded left eye. Her skin too soon cratered and turned purplish, worsened by her endless scratching. Her legs dimpled with scars. Why me? She wailed, and then, only once, a hissed whisper that Iris wondered if she misheard. It should have been you. Now, at 21, their hair is the same dark auburn, but Rose wears hers as a penance, draped forward to cover as much of her pocked cheeks as possible. Iris's is waist length and gathered into a long, dense plait, her skin tauntingly smooth and white. They no longer laugh together, they no longer whisper secrets, they do not talk about the shock. Some mornings Iris will wake up and see her sister staring at her with an expression which is so blank and cold that it frightens her. Iris feels her eyelids begin to sink, as heavy as if they had been sewn with lead weights. Mrs. Salter is attending to a customer, her voice a melodious hum. Most delicate care is taken with each commission, pure porcelain from the northern factories. We are a kind of family, indeed, such honest girls, so unlike those quacking bonnet touters on Cranbourne Alley. Immoral, the lot of them. Iris digs her fingers into her thighs to stay awake. As she lolls forward, she wonders if a few moments of sleep would really be so terrible. Larks, Rosie, she whispers, jolting upright and rubbing her arm. I should wonder you require a needle with elbows like that. If Mrs. Salter had seen. I can't bear it, Rosie whispers, I can't. Rosie is silent. I can bear it, Iris whispers, I can't. Rosie is silent. She worries a scab on her head. What would you do if we could escape here, if we didn't have to? We are lucky, Rosie murmurs. And what else can you do? Abandon me here because a molly saw. Become a molly saw. Of course I should not. Iris hisses back. I should like to paint real things, not these endless china eyes and lips and cheeks. And without realizing it, she is balling her fist. She unfurls it, tries to think of the pain she is causing her sister. But her illness was not Iris's fault, and yet she is punished for it every day, pushed out from any affection. I can't stand it here, living in the den of Madame Satin. Across the shop, Mrs. Salter's head revolves as sharply as an owl's. She frowns. Rose jumps and jabs herself with the needle. The door slams in the wind. Iris strains her eyes through the grimy paint windows. She sees the carriages rolling past and imagines the ladies cocooned inside. She bites her lip, shakes out a little blue powder, and dabs her paintbrush into the bottle of water once more. Pups. Now, you naughty pups, Silas says, the black wing of his hair falling forward as he takes his seat at the cellar desk. I'm sorry it's come to this, but if you hadn't helped yourself to cook's marzipan, things might have been different, he laughs, pleased with the history he has contrived, and lines up three knives of varying sizes. The conjoined puppies lie before him, bellies up. He thought at first of pickling the beasts, but instead he will make two specimens out of the pair by both stuffing and articulating them. When he builds his marble walled museum, the taxidermy form and skeleton will sit side by side in the entrance hall guarded by stucco columns. He wipes his forehead which sweats even in the November cold. He flexes his fingers, the largest knife chills his hand. He makes a small incision in the left puppy's abdomen and tugs the fur with an even pressure. His breath is a thin whistle between his teeth. He is careful not to puncture the flesh and the organs nestling below it, all packed tight behind a purple membrane. He shifts an inch to the left so that the hounds fall into the lamplight and then severs the pelt as far as he can, stopping short at the soft paw pads and lozenge shaped nose with four nostrils. He shifts an inch to the left so that the hounds fall into the lamplight and then severs the pelt as far as he can, stopping short at the soft paw pads and the lozenge shaped nose with four nostrils. The shadows make accuracy difficult, so he works more slowly, easing the smaller scalpel into the final cuts. As the day turns to dusk outside, he detaches the fur in a single piece. All those guests with no marzipan to go with their hothouse fruit and cream, such mischievous pups, he says, picturing them pristinely stuffed. If Gideon were to see him now, how he has improved in the 15 years elapsed, which have lapsed, but Silas swallowing the thought. He is determined to enjoy this part when the potential of the corpse lies before him, before its promise sours. For its promise sours. The thrill is a fresh the thrill is as fresh as it was when he found his first skull. Walk with me, he said to Flick that day as they left the pottery factory together, but for a reason he can't remember, he ended up alone in the countryside. It was then that he happened on the decaying corpse of a fox. He was disgusted at first and cupped his nose, but then he saw that its fur was as red as Flick's hair. The fox was perfect, fragile, each nugget of bone neater than a jigsaw. The creature had lived, breathed, and now existed in the curious liminality between beauty and horror. He touched its skull and then his own. He visited it each day, watching as maggots seized it, as its skin wasted and the intimacy of its white structure became apparent, like the slow bloom of a flower. He noticed new things each time, the surprising thinness of its thigh bone, the laced webbing of the cranium. Then he flicked it with his fingernail. It rang dully. Once the skull was entirely cleaned of meat, he wrapped it in a cloth and took it for himself. That summer, his skin, coated in a thick paste of dust and sweat, he raked over each tuft of grass, each hillock, each copse and river bank until he had 15 skulls. He set traps whittled sticks into spears and crept up on the old slow rabbits and pushed the air out in their throats with his fingers. Pushed the air out of their throats with his fingers. They scrabbled and kicked for the first minute, and he often held his breath with them. Then they would limp and still he would cling on just in case. How neatly he arranged the skulls. He thought he would be content with 5, 10, but he needed more. Each item made him happier and more anxious than the one before, and now he had his treasure. This furred, spidery beast, finer than anything he ever could have imagined as a boy, and he does not think he will ever want again. His work is as complete as he can manage that day, and he has learned from experience that he will ruin the specimen if he continues without pause. It must be almost 5 o'clock. He yawns, decides to rest. He places the skinned pups into a tin bucket. Later, when he has boiled off the meat, he will assemble the skeleton with tweezers, glue, and wire as thin as thread. He climbs the ladder to the shop and then the stairs to his attic. As he pulls on his nightgown, he glimpses the shelf of stuffed mice next to his bed. Each is dressed in a tiny costume. Silas picks up a brown mouse, he strokes its worsted skirts, the shawl he crocheted with the thinnest wool, the small round plate it grips in its paws. He places it back on the shelf and snuffs out the candle. He is almost asleep when he hears a knocking. He pulls the pillow over his head. Knocking becomes a dull thunder. Silas! He sighs. The impatience of the man. It's a blessing Silas has no neighbors to disturb and can't be read. Can't he read? It is a blessing Silas has no neighbors to disturb. And can't he read the closed sign? Ouvres la porte! Ouvre la porte! He groans, sits up, pulls on a jacket and trousers, lights a stuttering candle, and shoulders his way down the narrow staircase. Je vous, ma colombe! Mr. Frost! Silas says, opening the door. A tall, slender man in paint splattered rags stares back at him. He has a kind of frenzied magnetism about him, an entitlement and self belief that leaves Silas torn between wanting to please or despise him. Louis smiles. There, I knew you were in. I am here for my dove. If I haven't frightened him off his perch. He doesn't wait for a reply, but bellows at a figure silhouetted in the alley entrance and beckons him over here, late as ever. It is almost nightfall, and at first Silas struggles to identify the man trotting up the alley, swearing the fitted mounds of vegetable peelings and cinder dust. He comes closer, his face glints off Silas's lamp. Johanne Milias. He is so thin that he looks like an emaciated pony. Goodness, Louis, what happened to your clothes? I wouldn't dress my dog in that shirt. A treat to see you, Milias, as always, Louis says, entering the shop without either being invited or cleaning his boots on the iron scraper. It's a bit of luck you are still open, Milias says, following him in, and Silas doesn't contradict him. Silas has arranged my dove. Where is he then? Louis lifts the lion's skull with both hands and pretends to throw it at Milias. Rar, he says with a snort. Silas tenses, wishing he had the courage to ask him to put it down. Instead, he busies himself retrieving the dove from the cabinet. Heavens, it's splendid, just what I had in mind, the artist exclaims. He seizes it, strokes its head. If only my models would sit as still as you. Louis presses a guinea into Silas's palm, double of what they agreed. And Milias, you must buy a mouse for the corner of your Mariana. To add movement to that bare patch of canvas. He lifts a stuffed brown mouse from a shelf by its tail and says, I will take this too. She is fragile, Silas attempts, but Louis seems not to hear him and crams the bird and the mouse into a satchel head first. Silas watches the two men run down the narrow passageway, Louis's hands on the back of Milas's shoulders, performing some kind of skip on each third step. His lamp picks out Louis's ankles. The white flesh of his wrist, it reminds him of Flick, her touch that he had not felt in over 20 years. When they vanish into the darkness, Silas looks around his little shop and its own and its low ceiling, its small chipped dressers which he has done his best to paint, and the corners of his mouth pressed downwards. No more attacking crest sellers. Eh, he says, your new friend wouldn't like it.